My name is Michael O'Keefe. I'm an artist working here in Dallas, Texas. And I first became familiar with plaster as a material making waste molds on clay sculptures, which is the process that I'm going to demonstrate here in this video. The sculpture that I'll be casting in this video is a sculpture that was made from observation with a model. The first step in this process is to insert metal shims into the sculpture. The shims are meant to divide the sculpture into two sections. At this point, we want to apply the face coat of plaster to the first half of the sculpture using a brush. And then we want to take a spatula with a mixture of plaster that's further along in the process of setting up and add it to the edge of the mold using your spatula. Then we want to add one more coat of plaster to the rest of the mold so that it's about 3 layers thick. At this point, you can remove the shims, sliding them out carefully so that you don't affect the original clay sculpture. You want to carve out some registration holes with a sharp tool, a knife or a chisel. Here I'm painting on a clay slip to the shim line of the mold. This clay slip is just diluted clay or clay that's been mixed with water. Once the slip is applied, then we can mix up another batch of plaster and start to brush it on the sculpture. After the first face coat, we can then add another coat of thin plaster to the mold. Once both sides of the mold have 3 coats of plaster, and the plaster has sufficiently set on both sides, then it's time to crack open the mold. At first, you should chisel very lightly until the seam line fractures just slightly. At this point, I like to stick butter knives in the crack and wiggle them a little bit to loosen the 2 halves of the mold. The type of mold we're making here is a waste mold, which means not only is the mold wasted after one cast, but also the sculpture is often wasted in the process of pulling apart this mold. Once you've cleaned out as much of the clay as you can, you want to then soak the sculpture in water. And then you want to soak each half of the mold 3 times, rinsing the mold in between each application of the soap. At this point, we can rejoin the 2 halves of the mold and then secure them together using burlap dipped in plaster and then dollops of plaster. Once the plaster that is joining the 2 halves of the mold together is fully set, then we can turn the mold upside down. At first, it's best to pour enough plaster to fill only about 1/3 of the mold and then slosh it around. Then we can add more plaster, filling the mold almost all the way to the top. Then you can tap it with a hammer, trying to get out as many of the air bubbles as possible. Then we can begin to remove the supports, including the supports that hold the 2 halves of the mold together. At this point, it's best to wait at least an hour to make sure that the poured plaster is sufficiently set inside the mold. Then it's time to crack open the 2 halves of the mold. I start at the top of the mold, and I tap lightly at first, trying to open that small seam. Once all of the large pieces of the mold are removed, you may have to use a smaller tool to pull out some small pieces of the mold. Assuming the mold is made properly, in the end, one should have a perfect replica of the clay sculpture.